Last summer, in the heart of Arkansas' scenic wilderness, Caroline and her fiancé, James, went on a camping trip that promised peace and serenity. Their secluded campsite, nestled under tall pine trees and surrounded by the soothing sounds of nature, was an elaborate getaway. It was a much-needed vacation before their upcoming wedding, a moment when they could savor their time together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the campsite, Caroline and James busied themselves with preparing a delicious dinner over a crackling fire. The aroma of roasting meat filled the air, and they enjoyed the simple pleasure of cooking outdoors. However, the tranquil evening was suddenly shattered by a hoarse cry for help that pierced the silence of the forest. Caroline and James exchanged frightened glances, concern reflected on their faces, and they dropped what they were doing and listened intently. The scream echoed through the trees, growing louder and more desperate with each passing moment. Without hesitation, the couple grabbed flashlights that cut through the darkness and rushed to the source of the distress call. Apparently, the cry was coming from a neighboring campsite, and they began to scramble through the maze of tents and trees in search of an urgent plea for help. Eventually, their frantic search led them to the campsite, where they found a disheveled and swaying man on his feet, clearly intoxicated. He was standing in a nightmarish pool of his own blood. It was a gruesome sight. The knife had accidentally hit an artery in his ankle. Caroline and James panicked, but they knew there was no time to lose. Hands steady, they rummaged through their hiking gear and found a first aid kit. Working together, they managed to stop the bleeding and dress the wound as best they could. The injured man was writhing in pain, but he remained conscious and his life hung in the balance. Caroline reached for the phone, trembling fingers dialing the number to call an ambulance. But her heart sank when she realized there was no cell service in this neck of the woods. The nearest hope, a hospital, was 20 miles away, and the man's condition was growing more serious by the second. In a moment of desperate determination, Caroline made a life-changing decision. With James' help, they carefully lifted the injured man and placed him in the back of their truck. Adrenaline surged in Caroline's veins as she climbed into the driver's seat. She knew she had to get the man to the hospital as quickly as possible. The trip was an ordeal. Blood, the sight of which had made Caroline extremely squeamish, was now everywhere. Caroline gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles were white, keeping her eyes on the winding road through the woods. The minutes dragged on, each one seeming like an eternity. The condition of the wounded man in the back of the truck was becoming more and more serious. He began to speak slurredly, hinting at the threat of unconsciousness. 12 minutes later, they arrived at the hospital. Caroline haphazardly parked the car at the hospital entrance, and her hands trembled as she rushed to get help. As soon as the hospital doors opened, the medical staff quickly took control of the situation. Tears came to Caroline's eyes as she watched the man being carried inside, leaving an icy pool of blood on the truck mat. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Caroline approached the nurse and reported that the injured man had been stabilized. He had 18 stitches, and the doctor made the sobering conclusion that if Caroline and James had not come to the rescue, or if they had waited for an ambulance that would never arrive, the man would have bled to death. Caroline and James left the hospital that evening, their hearts heavy with memories of the bloody journey to save a stranger. Their trek had taken an unexpected, terrifying turn, but they had shown tremendous bravery and had made a difference in the man's life through their actions. It was an unforgettable experience that they will forever remember. A reminder that heroes can appear even in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes courage is born in the darkest moments. Jordan and his wife Sarah had been looking forward to their trip to Lake Superior for months. It was a much-needed break from the hustle and bustle of the city, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. They carefully chose a secluded spot 15 feet from the edge of a sheer cliff overlooking the vast, sparkling expanse of Lake Superior. The day they arrived at their campsite was just perfect. The golden sun shone in the sky, casting a warm light on the calm waters below. Jordan skillfully set up the tent and Sarah laid out the camping supplies. They felt a sense of fulfillment as they gazed out at the breathtaking panorama. As evening fell, they gathered around the crackling fire, telling each other stories and gazing at the bright stars overhead. The night air was cool, and the rhythmic sound of the waves lapping against the shore was sleepy. Nature, however, had other plans. In the darkest hours of the night, a violent thunderstorm struck them. Lightning flashed in the sky, followed by deafening thunderclaps. The rain pounded relentlessly on the tent and the wind howled like an angry beast. Jordan and Sarah huddled together in the pitch darkness, the storm raging both outside and inside them. It was a night of terror they would never forget. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the storm had mercifully subsided. The exhausted couple unzipped their rain-soaked tent, expecting to see their beloved Lake Superior in all its majestic splendor. But what they saw made them shudder. Their camp had shifted during the storm. The once safe distance of 15 feet from the bluff was gone. Now they were dangerously close, just 3 feet from the cliff, and beyond it was a sheer drop of more than 100 feet into the unforgiving waters of Lake Superior. Jordan and Sarah couldn't believe their eyes. The hurricane had changed the landscape in a matter of hours, putting them in mortal danger they hadn't anticipated. Panic gripped them as they imagined what might have happened if they had fallen asleep, or if the storm had been even more ferocious. Jordan, as the saner of the two, sprang into action. He took a rope and fastened it to a sturdy tree, creating a makeshift barrier. This was to serve as a lifeline and prevent them from accidentally falling while they devised a plan to get out of the perilous situation. Sarah, still shuddering from the shock of their near failure, stared at the edge of the cliff. Lake Superior, often serene and alluring, now seemed menacing and treacherous. The realization of how close they had come to tragedy was overwhelming. Throughout the day, Jordan and Sarah tried to find a way to move their camp safely. The problem was that the ground near the cliff was unstable and treacherous, making it difficult to find a safe place. They couldn't stay there. It was too dangerous. With heavy hearts, they decided to dismantle their camp, load their gear on their backs, and carefully move away from the cliff. They moved with painstaking precision, step by step, constantly looking back at the ground for steady footing. Hours passed, and progress was agonizingly slow. Every meter that took them away from the edge felt like a tremendous victory, but at the same time it was a reminder of the danger they had narrowly avoided. Finally, as the sun began to set, they found a relatively level and safe spot where they set up their camp again. The tent was pitched, the fire was lit, and the gear was carefully stowed. They sat by the fire, huddled together, their faces lit by the flickering flames. Jordan and Sarah had been brought to the brink of disaster, but together they had made it through. The experience had taught them to never take nature for granted and to always be prepared for the unexpected. As they watched the stars twinkle in the night sky, they felt a deep appreciation for the fragility of life and the power of their love. Their hike to Lake Superior turned into an unforgettable adventure that will forever connect them in ways they never imagined. Deep in the rugged wilds of Yellowstone National Park, a teenage Boy Scout named William embarked on an unforgettable camping trip. Accompanied by a group of his older companions and an experienced adult leader, Mr. Harrison, they trekked through the wilderness for 2 days. The path led them to a picturesque clearing at the foot of huge, tree-covered hills. As the sun dipped toward the horizon and flooded the camp with amber light, the campers set to work. Tents were pitched, fires were lit, and preparations for the evening meal began. Laughter and stories filled the air, merging with the symphony of the forest, which came alive with the quiet rustling of leaves and the songs of distant birds. As his friends busied themselves with the campfire and dinner, William felt an unusual urge. He separated from the group and began to walk slowly and silently up the slope, disappearing into the shadows of the tall trees. He had to answer the call of nature, and he was anxious to find a secluded spot. As he went deeper into the forest, a serene atmosphere enveloped him. A soft, cool breeze whispered with the foliage, and the soft crunch of needles under his boots was the only sound that accompanied him. Feeling calm and at one with nature, he chose the right place to dig a hole for his personal business. Squatting in the moonlight, he admired the celestial scene. The stars appeared in all their splendor and the silvery light of the moon cascaded downward, coloring the forest floor with an otherworldly glow. Mesmerized by the ethereal atmosphere, he couldn't help but look toward the ridge a few hundred yards away, where the moonrise was beginning. And then an eerie, chilling sight came into view. Against the moonlight he saw the shadowy figure of a cat-like creature perched on a ridge. The sight sent shivers down his spine and made his heart race. It was a cougar, a magnificent and majestic creature. Its piercing eyes glittered in the moonlight like balls of liquid silver and were fixed on the campfire below. The cougar's silhouette was powerful and commanding, and her shoulders showed the unmistakable marks of a predator. William's breath caught and he watched in awe and fear. The cougar stood on the hill and appeared to be watching their campfire. He knew that these elusive animals usually avoided human contact, but the mere presence of such a formidable predator in close proximity was both awe-inspiring and delightful. For what seemed like an eternity, William remained perfectly still, crouching in the moonlight and gazing at the feline watcher. The warmth of the campfire and the camaraderie of the camp seemed distant, replaced by the harsh reality of the wilderness. The puma, not noticing the boy's presence, continued to watch him from his vantage point. The moment was imprinted on his memory, and he felt both vulnerable and connected to the wilderness in a way he had never felt before. An eternity seemed to pass, and William's attention returned abruptly to the camp when he was called out by his concerned friends. He rose slowly, careful not to spook the cougar with a sudden movement. Reluctantly, he left his hiding place and returned to the campfire. Seated in a chair and still shaken by what he had seen, he couldn't resist the urge to share his story. His voice trembled as he pointed to the elusive big cat on the ridge, now bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. His friends were both fascinated and alarmed by the presence of such a magnificent predator silently watching them from afar. The group continued to gather around the campfire, their senses heightened and the air filled with excitement, wonder and fear. The puma still sat on the ridge like a mysterious sentinel, casting a long shadow over the camp. John found himself alone in a remote campground in northern Ohio, surrounded by the quiet embrace of the wilderness. It was his third and final night at this campground, which he had chosen as a respite from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The campground was located in a dense forest, a few miles from the nearest town. The solitude was both soothing and eerie, and the huge canopy of trees overhead gave the illusion of isolation. On this night, John's peaceful sleep was disturbed by the need to relieve himself. Grumbling, he unbuckled the hammock and stepped out into the moonlit night. By the light of a handheld flashlight, he moved about 10 feet away from his resting place. The air was crisp and cool, and the silence of the forest was both mesmerizing and frightening. As John eased off, his flashlight picked up something unusual. About 80 to 100 feet away, he spotted a dark figure. It appeared to be a man, and he had a flashlight in his hand. He looked fidgety, getting up and sitting down involuntarily. John's heart raced as he saw the figure in the distance. Instinctively, John realized he needed to investigate. He put on his boots and picked up his trusty axe, which he had brought with him just in case. With a sense of determination, he began walking in the direction of the mysterious figure, keeping to the right of his camp. However, John's sense of dread increased when he spotted another lantern much closer, about 40 meters away. The second figure was now walking beside him, echoing his every step. Out of fear and uncertainty, John sank to the ground and began to throw leaves over himself, hoping to blend in with the forest floor. The second figure continued walking, completely oblivious to John's presence. Finally, he stopped, lit a cigarette, and opened a can of beer. The sound of the can hitting the ground was insanely close. John held his breath, praying he wouldn't be discovered. When the figure moved far enough away so that he couldn't hear John's movements, John decided to act. He slowly stood up and walked towards the first figure. He was now close enough to hear the faint ringing of text messages coming in on the man's phone. John cautiously stepped closer and saw the man's face illuminated by the light of the phone. Curiosity mixed with terror as he realized the man was heading back towards his camp. Holding his breath, John remained lying on the ground in tense anticipation. His heart raced as he watched his flashlight turn on and off, and a succession of light beams pierced the night. In the darkness, he could hear the tossing of service in the dining room, and muffled voices made his presence known. "He was just here," they whispered. John's heart pounded frantically and he lay still, hesitant to take a breath. He watched the flashlight fade into the distance until only a small, dim light remained. He remained stealthy, not knowing who the intruders were or what their intentions were. The long, agonizing hours of the night passed, and as dawn broke over the horizon, John finally felt safe and returned to his camp. The sight that opened to his eyes was appalling. His parking lot lay in ruins, a chaotic mess of overturned equipment and debris. His favorite hammock and tarp had been ripped to shreds, as if by a vicious machete. His flask had been stomped into the dirt, and his backpack, rain gear, and flashlight had vanished without a trace. Determined to find answers, John headed toward the spot where he had originally spotted the first figure. There he found packets of chewing gum, 8 empty beer cans, and an abandoned lighter. It was in odd assortment, and John couldn't make sense of it. His next destination was where he observed the second figure. To his shock, he found an empty powder bag of what was later determined to be methamphetamine, as well as a pile of cigarette butts and a ghastly pile of feces that turned out to contain no toilet paper. The events of that fateful night shook John, and his seclusion became a haunting mystery. Who were the intruders and what did they want? That question lingered long after he left the wilderness, and the mystery haunted him for years to come. In the midst of a serene summer, Elizabeth and her husband went on an adventurous camping trip to Rock Island, Wisconsin. For the uninitiated, getting to this remote location was not difficult at all. One had to take a ferry from Door County to Washington Island, and from there take a second ferry to Rock Island. This was by no means an ordinary place, but a rugged, primitive land with a rich history, containing not one but 3 separate cemeteries and the remains of buildings left by the first settlers. On a clear and beautiful night, Elizabeth and her husband decided to admire the night sky, choosing a quiet field about a quarter-mile from their campsite as the perfect spot for stargazing. The path to this field led them past one of the island's eerie cemeteries, where old tombstones stood like silent guardians of the past. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness of the island, the surroundings took on an almost mystical quality. The stars twinkled overhead and the atmosphere was filled with the weight of history. However, an unexpected turn of events was to change this idyllic night. When they were halfway to their chosen field, a thick fog began to envelop them. The fog seemed to burst out of the darkness, enveloping the island in an icy embrace. Elizabeth and her husband decided not to stop there and continue their star trek. As they continued on their journey, however, Elizabeth began to feel a sense of unease. In the distance, amidst the looming fog, she noticed a faint, eerie glow. It was a pair of flickering phosphorescent eyes, like twin orbs in the night. Panic rose in her, and she asked her husband to shine a flashlight in that direction. When the light broke through the shroud of fog, their worst fears were realized. It wasn't just one eye, but several other pairs, blinking in the dim, surreal light. The figures stood still, their eyes strangely reflecting the lantern beam. The fog thickened, turning the encounter into an otherworldly experience. Elizabeth and her husband, looking into those eerie eyes, didn't realize what they were facing. The deep history of the island seemed to conspire with the thick fog and create an aura of the supernatural. Fear gripped them, and they rushed back toward their camp, breathing heavily and with their hearts pounding. In the night, the island seemed to come alive with mysterious, fleeting shapes. Shadows shifted and darted around them, and eerie sounds came through the fog. It was a surreal and frightening sight, as if the island itself was set against them. Upon reaching their campsite, they stumbled out, barely catching their breath. Collapsing into chairs, they looked back at the path they had traveled, convinced that they were being stalked by something otherworldly. The panic gradually passed as they realized the truth. The island was not haunted by ghosts or evil spirits, but by charming, albeit slightly mischievous foxes. These intelligent creatures were attracted by the curiosity of the vacationers, and decided to pay them a visit as they left their stargazing spot. The glowing eyes in the distance were merely a reflection of the flashlight light in the animals' eyes,